January 19th, 1942. Before dawn, frigid air drifts beneath the canopy of leafless trees on the frozen banks of the Meuse River, near a nameless hamlet in eastern Belgium. A low fog clings to the snow, muting the moonlight, wrapping everything in milky silence until the crunch of boots and the rattle of steel disrupt the stillness. American soldiers from the 101st Infantry, mud-spattered and hollow-eyed, crouch behind a tangle of dried roots and felled logs. In the skeletal gloom, the spotter Private First Class Daniel Riley lifts binoculars to his fog glasses, scanning the opposing tree line for the barely perceptible flicker of movement. Somewhere, the enemy waits. Riley's fingers tense around the radio as the battalion's heavy machine gun team shivers behind him, poised to unleash a storm of lead the instant he gives the signal. For one breathless second, everything halts. The world narrows to the frost in Riley's lungs, the taste of iron, and the slow, inevitable squeeze of time pressing forward. The story of that single moment, Riley's second of silence, unfolds against a backdrop of unimaginable stakes. The winter of 1942 was a season of uncertainties, with both Allied and Axis forces ferociously jockeying for control of battered territory. American battalions hidden in these woods had orders to hold at all costs, bridging critical roads and delaying German advances until heavier armor could arrive. The spotter's split-second decision whether to call for fire or hold meant the difference between slaughter and salvation, not just for his squad, but for the entire battalion concealed behind American lines. In that frozen heartbeat, the fates of hundreds pivoted precariously on a single judgment call dot to understand why this fleeting episode meant so much. One must peer into the broader tapestry of carnage and confusion that defined early 1942, the European front. A vast chessboard of attrition and desperation had seen the Wehrmacht and Allies locked in a macabre rhythm of advance and entrenchment. Hitler's armies, confident from years of blitzkrieg victory, found their momentum blunted by tenacious American and British resistance. The Battle of the Bulge had not yet fully erupted, but skirmishes like this, on the edges of small villages, at uncertain river crossings, were its prologue. American GIS, newly arrived into the crucible of European warfare, grappled with both the elements and the chaos of an enemy transformed from relentless victor to frustrated defender. For German and Japanese soldiers alike, the old certainties, their feigned discipline, razor-sharp tactics, and expectation of American weakness suffered rude awakening. According to captured diaries and post-war accounts, both Axis armies had entered the conflict with deep predictions. Japanese officers, fresh from campaigns in China, had told their men that Americans, softened by easy living, would crumble under assault. German doctrine, while more measured, still wove an undercurrent of contempt for what was perceived as inexperienced amateur armies. But as the war dragged on, reality refused to yield to propaganda. On the Eastern Front, German units grew bitterly familiar with the industrial scale and swift adaptation of American logistics, and in the Pacific, Japanese troops found their intricate plans consistently shattered by unexpected American resolve and overwhelming firepower. The events that crystallized around Riley's decision unfolded with quiet, documentary certainty, verified in after-action reports and the testimony of survivors. The enemy reconnaissance patrol, a half-platoon of Wehrmacht infantry, emerged through the trees, momentarily lost in Riley's sights. American doctrine called for immediate suppression at signs of enemy activity, but Riley, recalling his orders and the proximity of friendlies on a flank, hesitated. For 1 second, he remained motionless, his mind racing, measuring shadow against certainty. The silence was electric. Then a flash. A German runner raised his arms, a white cloth fluttering in the chill. Had Riley given the signal, dozens would have died in the crossfire. Instead, his silence allowed for the patrol's surrender. The unexpected outcome rippled. The prisoners provided critical intelligence that exposed a planned night assault. The battalion adjusted its positions in time to foil the German attack hours later, likely saving the entire force. This percussive contrast, what the Axis soldiers expected and what they actually met, is etched in the bitter words of Japanese and German officers. In the Pacific, Lieutenant Jinjiro Amy's diary recorded at Guadalcanal. We were told the Americans were soft, but they did not run when we charged. Their guns did not stop firing. They had more bullets than we had men. At the Meuse, German prisoners reportedly told interrogators, "We thought you would panic." Instead, there was only waiting. You had food, supplies, or guns never silenced. For soldiers raised on the belief that spirit and aggression triumphed over everything, confronting an adversary where even a spotter's pause was a strategic calculation, a sign of discipline and control, was profoundly disorienting. The evidence is overwhelming, woven through countless official records, casualty tallies, and post-war reflections. American machine guns, especially the M1917A1, Browning, became an emblem of both tactical dominance and material abundance. While Axis machine guns often jammed or ran dry, Americans poured thousands of rounds with ceaseless fury, as long as ammunition and water-cooled jackets were tended. Each Yank carried more shells than our entire squads, a Japanese officer later lamented. An account from Guadalcanal confirmed. The Browning water-cooled is a demon. It does not jam. Its voice does not falter. As battle after battle exposed the staggering contrast between American logistical support and the ever-dwindling supplies on the Axis side, the reality sank deeper. Courage died on empty stomachs and behind dry barrels, more than any weapon or doctrine. An object emerges as the symbol of this American advantage, the ever-present olive drab can of Spam, carried in ration kits, featured in cheeky propaganda, and found bubbling in mess kettles from Normandy to New Guinea. Spam represented more than calories. It embodied the industrial might and everyday abundance of American society. Axis prisoners marveled at canned meat in every pack, while their own rations dwindled to black bread or thin rice gruel. In diaries and oral histories, many remembered the Spam can not just as food, but as a talisman of the superpower's ability to sustain its warriors in any field, at any hour. In the hands of Riley and his fellows, its dull metallic ring became, quite literally, the sound of democracy. The military had purchased roughly 150 million pounds of Spam by war's end, enough to feed entire armies across 2 oceans and 3 continents. American soldiers complained endlessly about its monotony, its salty taste, its rubbery texture. They composed bitter ditties and wrote scathing letters home, yet the fact remained, they never went hungry. Enemy soldiers, by contrast, watched their own supply lines collapse. German units in the winter of 1944 scraped by on turnips and sawdust bread. Japanese garrisons on Pacific atolls, cut off by American submarines, resorted to starvation rations, boiling roots, and leather. The contrast was stark, visceral, and impossible to ignore. One German prisoner, interviewed at a camp in Pennsylvania, remarked with astonishment, "You have meat every day." We had not seen meat in months. Yet the story was not merely one of machines or rations, but of slow, grinding transformation in belief. For the Germans and Japanese, the shock of defeat at places like the Meuse or Guadalcanal was not just physical, it was ideological. The sense of invincible destiny gave way to the recognition that the war would not be won by willpower or tradition alone, but by systems of supply, intelligence, technology, and most of all, restraint. The American spotter's 1 second of silence signaled not just discipline, but an emergent philosophy. That calculated action, informed by collaboration and the preservation of life, could bring victory as surely as any heroic charge. "We do not shoot until we are sure," an American officer wrote in a 1943 field manual. "We do not waste lives or fortunes. We make every bullet count." The role of the forward observer, the artillery spotter, was itself a revelation in modern warfare. Unlike the infantry grunt or tank commander, the spotter operated in a shadowy realm between action and thought, between violence and precision. Armed with binoculars, a radio, and maps marked with coordinates, the observer's task was to see, to calculate, and to direct the thunder of distant guns onto enemy positions with pinpoint accuracy. In the Battle of the Bulge, observers saved entire battalions by calling down fire on advancing panzers before they could overrun American lines. In the Vosges Mountains of France, the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion's precision allowed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team to rescue the so-called Lost Battalion without hitting friendly troops, a feat that required absolute trust, discipline, and communication. The observers, often alone or in pairs, pushed forward into no man's land, beyond the safety of American trenches, to gain the best view of enemy movements. They lived on the knife's edge of death, vulnerable to snipers, ambushes, and counter-battery fire. Yet their value was immeasurable. A single observer could orchestrate the firepower of an entire battalion, dozens of howitzers, hundreds of shells with devastating effect. The Germans and Japanese, despite their own artillery traditions, struggled to match this level of coordination. Their communication networks were fragile, their supply chains unreliable. By contrast, American artillery observers had radios that worked, batteries that lasted, and the unwavering support of a logistical empire that stretched back across the Atlantic dot as months passed, and the Allies moved from defensive to offensive operations. Reverberations of this discipline echoed across the globe. Axis propagandists were forced to revise their caricatures. Leaflets intercepted in Europe began warning, "The American, he waits. He watches. He strikes only when he chooses, and always with more than you expected." Meanwhile, American soldiers, often the children of immigrants or the first in their families to leave the farm for the wider world, internalized a sense of trust and patience, in teamwork, and in the invisible abundance carried quietly in their packs. The transformation endured beyond the battlefield. Prisoners of war, captured in those same icy woods or on sun-blasted Pacific beaches, experienced a second awakening in American camps. Many wrote home in awe of meals, medical care, the ubiquity of books and music, even the luxury of Spam every day, 3 times if we wish. Democrats and non-democrats alike found themselves recalibrating what modern power could mean. The 1 second of silence became, by slow degrees, a metaphor for the American promise, a will to abundance, not just in arms, but in culture, to democracy, not as a slogan, but as a lived, collective discipline. German POWs held in camps across the United States reported shock at the conditions. Unlike the brutal camps of the Eastern Front or the privations of German military prisons, American facilities offered adequate food, medical treatment, and even recreation. Prisoners ate the same rations as American soldiers, including the ubiquitous Spam, and were permitted to buy beer in camp canteens. Some worked on farms or in factories, earning wages they could send home. For many, the experience shattered years of Nazi propaganda about American decadence and moral rot. "We expected brutality," one prisoner wrote. "We found humanity." In occupied Germany and Japan, the contrast deepened. American forces brought with them not only weapons, but refrigerated trucks, field kitchens, and mountains of supplies. German civilians, starving in the rubble of bombed-out cities, watched American soldiers distribute rations, set up soup kitchens, and rebuild infrastructure with efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. A British political advisor noted in February 1946 that the Americans have built up against them a strong feeling of resentment, if not hate, and of contempt among nearly all classes of the German population, not because of cruelty, but because of envy. The Germans could see the abundance the Americans enjoyed, and it highlighted their own misery. Yet beneath the resentment lay something else: admiration, grudging, but real. The Germans had been told that democracy made nations weak, that individualism bred chaos, that only authoritarian discipline could sustain a modern state. But here were Americans undisciplined by German standards, slouchy, informal, who had nonetheless crushed the Sioux, Wehrmacht with overwhelming force, and rebuilt the shattered continent with breathtaking speed. The contradiction gnawed at the foundations of fascist ideology. If democracy was weak, why had it won? If abundance was decadence, why did it produce such power? In Japan, the reckoning was even more profound. Japanese civilians had been taught to fear American occupation as a nightmare of rape, murder, and enslavement. Instead, they found soldiers handing out chocolate bars to children, medics treating Japanese wounded, and General Douglas MacArthur overseeing a reconstruction effort that would transform Japan into an economic powerhouse within 2 decades. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. "We were told you were demons," one Japanese woman recalled, "but you were kind." The symbolism of Spam, and objects like it, ran deeper than mere sustenance. It represented a society capable of producing more than it needed, of waging war without sacrificing the comforts of home, of projecting power across oceans without exhausting itself. When American G's shared their rations with starving civilians, whether in France, Germany, or the Philippines, they were not just offering food. They were offering a vision of a different kind of future, one in which prosperity and freedom went hand in hand. On Pacific Islands liberated from Japanese occupation, locals remembered American soldiers sharing Spam from their K-rations. In the Philippines, prisoners freed from Japanese camps wept at the sight of American rations, not just because they were starving, but because the food represented rescue, survival, and the return of hope. In Hawaii, Samoa, and Guam, Spam became so embedded in local culture that it remains a staple to this day, a culinary legacy of the war. The 1 second of silence became, by slow degrees, a metaphor for the American promise, a will to abundance, not just in arms, but in culture, to democracy, not as a slogan, but as a lived, collective discipline. In the years that followed, the story of the silent spotter faded among the tides of greater battles, obscure but undiminished. Veterans told it quietly. How in that second, the choice to wait, to measure, to refrain from blind volley, was itself an act of leadership more enduring than any mere trigger pull. In memoirs and reunions, Riley's name became a symbol, a talisman like his dented Spam can, ordinary, easily overlooked, but holding within it the impossible plenty of possibility. As the war ended and nations rebuilt, the symbolism deepened. The ringing of Spam tins and the silence before decision echoed in kitchens and parliament halls. Riley's second, that moment of poised restraint, is now remembered as evidence not only of tactical acumen, but of a democratic ethos made flesh, the courage to pause, to think, and to value the lives both of enemies and friends. The battlefield of the Meuse is long grown over now, roots tangled where boots once pressed down. But the lesson endures. The forward observers who fought in World War II have largely passed into history, their stories preserved in fading letters, grainy photographs, and the archives of military historians. But their legacy lives on in the doctrine of modern artillery, in the emphasis on precision over brute force, and in the recognition that war is won not by those who shoot first, but by those who shoot wisely. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which rescued the Lost Battalion with the help of pinpoint artillery support, became the most decorated unit in American military history, a testament to the power of coordination, discipline, and the refusal to waste lives. The can of Spam, too, has become a relic, a symbol of a bygone era. But its meaning endures. In museums and memorials, original tins sit behind glass, rusted and dented, silent testaments to the industrial might that fed an army and won a war. In Pacific kitchens, grandmothers still fry slices for breakfast, passing down recipes that date back to the day American soldiers first shared their rations. And in the halls of power, where generals and politicians debate strategy, the lesson of the Spam can remains that abundance is not decadence, that democracy is not weakness, and that victory belongs to those who can sustain the fight, day after day, meal after meal, until the job is done. Freedom sometimes finds its greatest truth not in the shout or the gun's roar, but in the deliberate, courageous silence before the storm. Out of that quiet sprang not merely survival, but a vision of abundance, an unyielding commitment to life, liberty, and the dignity of every decision. The clang of a ration tin, the hush before a command, the sparing of a single battalion, these are the measures and memories of democracy's one profound second. In the frozen woods of Belgium, in the jungles of Guadalcanal, in the mountains of France, and in the camps where prisoners learned that the enemy was not a monster, but a man everywhere, the same truth echoed. War is not won by those who rush to kill, but by those who have the wisdom, the discipline, and the abundance to wait, to think, and to act with precision. The story of Private First Class Daniel Riley and his 1 second of silence is, in the end, the story of a nation that came of age in the crucible of global war. It is the story of ordinary men and women who carried with them not just rifles and radios, but cans of Spam and the values of a free society. It is the story of a world forever changed by the realization that democracy, for all its mésalliances and inefficiency, possessed a strength that no dictatorship could match, the strength to feed its people, to trust its soldiers, and to build a future in which silence, patience,